Welcome, everyone. Today's topic is Placing Black History on Display, Booker T. Washington in Florida, March 1912. And our guest is prominent historian Dr. David Jackson. I'm Cynthia Gandy Zinneber of the Henry Plant Museum. And today's talk enhances the current exhibit now on display titled When the Train Comes Along, Booker T. Washington at the Tampa Bay Casino. It was guest curated by Dr. Charles McGraw-Grow and will be on display through December of this year. So we hope you'll have a moment or at least a day perhaps to see it. Dr. Jackson is currently professor of history, Associate Provost for Graduate Education, and Dean of the School of Graduate Studies at Florida A&M University. He has authored numerous books, articles, scholarly papers, but when I ask about his accomplishments, he is most proud of the dozens of students he has trained who are now full professors themselves. And one of his students, interestingly, was Ibram Kendi, who we've all been hearing a lot about recently. Dr. Jackson is going to speak about 40 minutes, and then we'll spend about 10 minutes answering your questions, if any. So please feel free to type them anytime into the chat feature on your computer. And now I'm very, very honored to welcome Dr. David Jackson.
Well, thank you, Cynthia Zinneber, for such a gracious introduction. And also I would like to thank Susan Carter, who is the curator at the Henry Plant Museum, for inviting me to share some perspective with you on Booker T. Washington's tour of Florida, his visit in 1912, and also Lindsay Huban for technical support here this afternoon. So I've been working in administration for many, many years, and I'm excited to have an opportunity to delve back into this scholarly work and to talk about putting or placing Black progress on display, Booker T. Washington in Florida in March of 1912. And so I guess I will begin by sharing with you all how I arrived at looking at this research. Years ago, when I was working on my doctoral dissertation at the University of Memphis, I was researching a gentleman by the name of Charles Banks, who you'll hear more about in just a few moments. But Charles Banks would be a person who organized Booker T. Washington's tour of Mississippi. And after I moved to Florida several years later, I decided to conduct some research to see how and if Washington had visited Florida. And of course, I found out that he did, and that would actually pique my interest in working on this topic quite a while ago. So let me just jump right in and get started here. You all should know that Booker T. Washington won many followers and supporters by taking these educational tours, or what he also called educational pilgrimages throughout several states. And he took these tours, I've concluded, for four major reasons. First of all, to inspire, encourage, and show that African Americans were making progress and that they needed to continue to move onward and upward. And this was to demonstrate that among African Americans themselves. Second, to solidify his position as the foremost leader of the Black race, especially against opposition that was occurring from the Niagara movement and later the NAACP. But a third reason he took these tours was to counter prevailing white stereotypes that African Americans were degenerating since the end of slavery and actually retreating into barbarism. And fourth, to show whites in the North and the South that Black people were advancing despite assertions by some to the contrary. So in essence, these were not literally educational tours in terms of academic learning, but what Washington saw as an opportunity to educate himself and, more importantly, others about the progress of the Black race. And so Washington actually started these statewide tours by traveling through the Arkansas and Oklahoma territories in 1905, and they won him some support for his agenda. But his most successful tour early on featured Mississippi, where he visited in 1908. And as I stated at the beginning of my remarks, the person who organized and directed this tour was Charles Banks, who you see pictured here. And this tour was significant because it would set the standard for the other tours that Booker T. Washington would subsequently take throughout the South. So Washington was like a modern day politician on the campaign trail, traveling throughout the South and promoting his platform, agenda, and strategies for racial uplift. So in Mississippi alone, he spoke to an estimated 40 to 80,000 people in total. And I believe, based on my research and looking at all of the tours that he took through the South, it's highly likely that Washington spoke to over 1 million Black and white people through these campaigns over a 5-year period. And so, where did Washington go? In 1909, after he visited Mississippi, Washington would ultimately travel through 9 southern states. He traveled through South Carolina. He traveled through Virginia, West Virginia, and Tennessee in 1909. He traveled through Delaware and North Carolina in 1910, Texas in 1911, Florida in 1912, and then Louisiana in 1915. And one of the people, Charles Banks, of course, was a very distinguished and leading citizen of his community and the state of Mississippi. And I understand that there's a very esteemed scholar that wrote a biography on Charles Banks, yours truly. But Charles Banks, of course, is the person, and it was through this work that I actually learned more about the operations of Washington's tours and the effectiveness of the tours and why he actually traveled to these different states. All right, Washington, his tours were sponsored by the state and local affiliates of the National Negro Business League. And that was a group that Washington founded of businessmen and women in 1900 in Boston. And this is a picture that they took up in Boston in 1900 after that meeting. And so this would be the group that will ultimately serve as an umbrella group for sponsoring his tours through the state affiliates of the National Negro Business League. And also, Washington realized that as he started to take these educational tours, it became more than just about promoting himself and his personal agenda. In a broader sense, Washington was taking these tours to address the so-called Negro problem that was prevalent, so-called at that time, and really to challenge white racist notions about Black degeneration and retrogression into barbarism since slavery. So, for example, there was a man, an author by the name of Richard Carroll, who wrote a book that was over 200 pages called The Negro, a Beast, or in the Image of God. And as you can see with some of these illustrations in this book, that he juxtaposed his perception of what he thought Christ looked like against what he thought the Son of God would look like versus what, in his imagination, Black men look like, Black people look like. And you can see that the figure that he had, of course, dehumanizes and portrays this African American, if you want to call it that, as not being human. Another picture in his book, he showed his image and his thought about what he believed the Virgin Mary and the child Christ would look like. And he's posing the question of whether or not a Black child could be of the same flesh as the Virgin Mary. He would also exacerbate white fears about Black men wanting to have white women, include in this book this notion that as a free person, then Black people would be going and trying to marry, Black men trying to marry white women. And there were some strong thoughts about that as well, and what the conclusion of that might lead to in their minds, at least. And then this is another picture showing the juxtaposition of a dove versus a crow, and whether or not they could come from the same source as human beings. And so I think that this is significant for you all to understand, because it was part of a process of dehumanizing African Americans in the absence of slavery. It was not a moment where everything was copacetic after slavery ended. It was in fact very challenging, and this is one of the challenges that African Americans had to deal with. And so, for example, you see depicted here Senator Ben Tillman, who was a white racist demagogue from South Carolina, and he made the argument that the Black race had degraded since freedom. And he said that under slavery that the Negro was exceedingly well behaved. He said, but he thought that they had become, in the absence of slavery and since emancipation, inoculated with the virus of equality and turned into a fiend, a wild beast seeking whom they may desire. And in his attempt to explain his paranoia that as free people, that Black people in this country were going to mistreat whites as they had been mistreated, Tillman argued that African Americans planned to, this is a quote, kill the white men, marry their women, and use white children as servants. And so there was a true paranoia around what freedom meant for people of African descent. And so the effort to dehumanize Black people in this country expanded throughout not only the South, but also the North as well. And so if you look at this picture of this man named Ota Benga, who was brought to the United States by a missionary to be placed on display at the St. Louis Fair in 1904. It was a very tragic story because he was a phenom in terms of people coming to watch him. He was brought over from the Congo in West Africa, and he was placed as an exhibit at the St. Louis Fair. And so many people came to see him in amazement, and there proliferated stories that he was the missing link in Darwin's theories of evolution between humans and animals, that he attracted a lot of attention. So after the fair was over, he was moved to the New York Bronx Zoo. And there were, in one day, I believe it was about 16,000 people came out to see the so-called pygmy in the zoo. He was made to look like a cannibal because his teeth were shaved. People would try and promulgate the notion that people in Africa were cannibals and that they ate each other. They put him in a cage with an orangutan and actually displayed him as being subhuman. And it took the protest of Black leaders in New York to cause this to come to an end. Tragically, Ota Benga committed suicide before he was able to leave the United States. And so my point to you all is that these are the types of forces that Washington is going to be working against as he's traveling around to place Black progress on display. And so it's clear that Washington and other Bookerites work to subvert these theories. And he did this by placing Black doctors, Black lawyers, Black bishops, journalists, Black businessmen, undertakers, educators, farmers, children, and the like on display by exposing the fallacy of these claims of Black retrogression in the absence of slavery. Moreover, Washington displayed manliness and character through these trips. And so what he wanted to do was to make it more difficult for races to seize upon Black suffering and oppression and perpetuate myths of white superiority. So through these trips, he demonstrated that Black men were in fact educated and successful in various endeavors. He showed that not only were they educated, but they had nice homes and churches. These were all symbols of success during the Victorian era. And Washington made sure that he put these things on display, starting with his own home. This is his first home that he had in Tuskegee, a two-story home. It was torn down later for a newer residence that was a brick home. This is called the Oaks, and is still in existence today. This is a 6-bedroom house that Washington has that's still in existence. It's on the National Park Services Registry, and this is a current picture of it. But of course, you could visit the house today. But this is one example of homes, and this is just another home, right? Because part of the tours was that Washington was able to visit the homes of prominent people in all of the places that he traveled. And so this is the home of Joseph Bldg, who was from Jacksonville, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. But really, the trip was aimed to publicize the incongruence between what people were hearing and what they were actually seeing, what some people were writing versus what African Americans were actually accomplishing. And so one of the things I've learned is that although he was not the wealthiest African American, Booker T. Washington became perhaps the most influential Black leader in the history of the country up to the election of President Barack Obama. Booker T. Washington's influence extended throughout Black America into white America in ways that really have not been repeated by any other African American. He had control over the Black press. He had support and influence from the talented 10th and white philanthropists. He served as an advisor to both Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, two presidents of the country. He was the founder of Tuskegee Institute, the National Negro Business League, the Tuskegee Farmers Conference, and he also had close connections with Black bishops, ministers, educators, journalists, and Masonic leaders. So all of these things gave Washington an inordinate amount of power that has literally gone unmatched in many respects. And so I've made this argument before many scholarly audiences, and it's hard to challenge that in terms of our experiences because of the connections that Washington had through the so-called Tuskegee machine. So let's move on to Florida. One of the race leaders and contemporaries of Booker T. Washington was a man by the name of Bishop Henry McNeal Turner. And Turner called Florida a paradise for Black people and said it was a place where African Americans could make a lot of money. But unfortunately, race relations in Florida in the early 20th century were not good. In fact, race relations in Florida were worse for Black people in many ways than for African Americans in other southern states like Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Texas. And although Florida is not usually thought of as a deep South state, white Floridians carried the same attitudes and assumptions of superiority as other southern whites. So what am I talking about? Florida had its share of lynching and mob violence. Residential segregation existed in Florida, Black codes, discrimination, and even the destruction of one of its all-Black towns called Rosewood. The Democratic Party controlled the political system in Florida and operated on the tenet of white supremacy. Florida led the nation with 11 lynchings in 1920. And between 1880 and 1930, Black people were more likely to be lynched in Florida than any other southern state on a per capita basis. So for every 100,000 Black people in Florida, about 80 were lynched, compared to Mississippi, which followed at a relatively distant second at about 53 per 100,000. You see the picture displayed here is the lynching that took place in Marianna, Florida, Claude Neal in 1934. And what's interesting here is that this was advertised in the newspapers. Over 5,000 people from 11 states came to participate and witness the lynching of Claude, Neal, and Marianna. So Turner was incorrect when he talked about Florida being a paradise for people of African descent, because they suffered in Florida just like they did in Georgia, where he lived. All right. Booker T. Washington would actually, prior to 1912, he would cause a great stir in the Sunshine State on at least 2 occasions. Once in 1901, after he had dinner with President Theodore Roosevelt at the White House. He was invited to the White House, and after it became public that an African-American had been invited to the White House, there was an uproar throughout the South in particular, and Florida was no exception to that. And if you all will go back and listen to John McCain's concession speech after Barack Obama won the presidency, he actually made reference to how the country responded to a Black man being invited to dinner at the White House, and how at that point in 2008, there was a Black man who was going to become president of the United States, in terms of him acknowledging the progress that had taken place in the country. But this certainly caused great commotion throughout the country. Again, in 1903, when Washington was scheduled to speak to a mixed audience in Gainesville, it caused a tremendous backlash, and people made reference and, were asking all kinds of questions about whether or not he felt entitled as a Black person to speak to Black and white audiences, right? And they hearkened back to the dinner at the White House and felt that Washington in some ways felt privileged because of that. And so that's a backdrop to Washington actually coming to the state of Florida. So his visit to Florida was actually sponsored by the Florida State Negro Business League. And it was comprised of some of the leading African-American businessmen and women. And it was organized in May of 1906 in Jacksonville. And so African-American business people from all over the state were invited to attend. And they believed that they could form a strong organization, which in fact they would do. We know very little about that first meeting, but the second meeting occurred in Tallahassee in June of 1907. And it was actually attended by a man by the name of Matthew M. Lewey, who was a publisher of the Florida Sentinel newspaper, James C. Napier, who was out of Nashville, but he was a delegate from the executive committee of the National Negro Business League, Nathan B. Young, who was the president of Florida A&M College, and Professor John G. Riley, who was a very prominent educator and businessman in Tallahassee. The invitation to Washington, of course, would grow out of a Florida State Negro Business League meeting in Live Oak. And Matthew M. Lewey is the person who actually organized and conducted Washington's party through the state. He was the state president of the Florida State Negro Business League. And I kind of showed him to, I will show him to you in just a moment. But Lewey is the person who took the lead. He served as the Charles Banks of Florida. And so when Washington visited Florida, he would travel with 20 to 35 distinguished African Americans at different points on the tour. And this is just a picture of the entourage of gentlemen that Washington had with him. And if you look at this image in juxtaposition to the image projected of Ota Benga, or those images in the book, it shows people who are cultured and civilized. And this was part of the aims of Washington and his tours. Among the people with Washington when he visited Florida was Charles Banks, of course, who was from Mississippi, as we mentioned, but James Napier. Napier at the time was from Nashville, but he served as the register of the US Treasury. So if you look at the dollar bills that were produced back then, it was his signature that was on the dollar bill. Dr. George C. Hall, who was Washington's personal physician and head of the Providence Hospital in Chicago, accompanied him. Dr. John A. Kinney, who was the head of the John A. Andrew Hospital in Tuskegee, was with him. Emmett Jay Scott, Washington's personal secretary, was with him. I have a couple of shots of him as well. Major R. Moton, Matthew M. Lewey, as you see here, and just a host of others, like Robert Lloyd Smith, who was a former member of the House of Representatives in the Texas legislature. Alain Leroy Locke, who was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Harvard University, an English professor at Howard University. And I share this with you all so you will understand that a lot of times people have gotten confused about who the talented 10th actually supported. These are members of the talented 10th in the African-American community, and they supported Booker T. Washington. And so let me just ask that you all travel with me now to go on a tour of Florida with Booker T. Washington. Washington would enter the state of Florida through Pensacola, and he would travel from Pensacola to Tallahassee, from Tallahassee to Lake City, from Lake City to Ocala, from Ocala to Tampa, from Tampa to Lakeland, and then to Eatonville, Palatka, Daytona Beach, and his last stop was in Jacksonville, and he made a number of whistle stops along the way. And he also traveled with his own private rail car for his own safety and security, and also to avoid the humiliation of Jim Crow travel. His tour lasted from March 1st through the 7th, and he would talk to a tremendous number of people throughout the state. The first stop was at Pensacola. That was the home of Matthew M. Lewey. And as I stated, Lewey served on the executive committee of the National Negro Business League, but he published one of the first Black newspapers in Florida called the Florida Sentinel beginning in 1887. Lewey was a very successful newspaper man, boasting the second largest advertising patronage of any Black paper in the South. Before he started this newspaper, he worked as a teacher, a postmaster, mayor of Noonesville, Florida. He served in the Florida House of Representatives, and he was among the earliest licensed African-American lawyers in the state of Florida. Washington, when he visited Pensacola, he said that they had a typical Negro business community there that illustrated how African-Americans had progressed since the Civil War. In terms of the demographics, it was about 28,000 people in Pensacola, divided by race, equally by race, so about 14,000 of each. But Washington was pleased to see that Pensacola had a healthy, progressive Black business community, and that they paid property taxes on about $500,000 worth of property. Unfortunately, this prosperity did not last for long. Nonetheless, when Washington visited Pensacola, he would always invite Black and white people to attend these events, and also have prominent whites to participate on the programs. And so when he was in Pensacola in 1912, Mayor Frank Riley would introduce him to the audience. And before Washington began his address, he had Robert Moton, who was at that time an employee, the commandant at Hampton Institute, and he would become Booker T. Washington's successor at Tuskegee, to lead the audience in a few old-time spirituals. And so Washington spoke at the Opera House in Pensacola to about 2,000 people, and of that number, about 800 of them were white. And while in Pensacola, he encouraged those in attendance and told them that we not only have the advantage of securing land in Florida, but also the advantage of finding plenty of work. And Washington thought that African Americans did not have to spend a lot of time trying to find and to seek labor. He said instead of them having to seek labor, labor would seek them out, right? And so one of the reasons he had this perspective was because when he traveled to Europe and visited London, Scotland, Berlin, Budapest, Sicily, Hungary, and Naples, he saw a lot of beggars on the street and people who could not find work. And he thought that that was not the case for people of African descent. And so this is just a picture of Washington speaking at one of these events. One of the things he said was that during his talks, he said, and he would give basically some version of the same speech at all of the places where he visited. But he said that while Black people face many disadvantages throughout the South, that the soil drew no color line, and that it would yield as much to the touch of the blackest hand in Florida as it would to the touch of the whitest hand in Florida. He thought that the rain and the sun would draw no color line. So in these ways, he thought that people of African descent were placed on the same footing. During this lecture, he also encouraged Black people not to waste time. He encouraged them not to waste time. He said that he wanted to impress upon the people in the Black community that an idle man or idle woman must be gotten rid of, and that they should go to work. And he thought that this kind of behavior, that idleness of people, would lend credence to stereotypes about Black laziness and shiftlessness. He also, during his speeches, would admonish whites to do their part by setting a good example, because he felt that Black people would follow their lead. And if white people would follow the law, Washington believed that African Americans would follow the law. And I don't have the time to go into it at this point, but Washington, I argue, and other work that I've done, he found a way to convey his messages to Black and white people to not be offensive, but to still strongly convey the different points that he was making. And so oftentimes you would have journalists and people who would write about Washington's visits, and they would make reference to white journalists to the advice that Washington had for the Black people in the audience without making mention of his advice to white people to stop conducting violence against African Americans and discriminating against African Americans, etc. And so Washington would leave Pensacola and travel to Tallahassee. He made a whistle stop in Quincy, Florida. And from Quincy, he would travel to Tallahassee, which was the next major stop along the way. Tallahassee was a place where about over 76% of the population was a Black population. And of the 170 lynchings that had occurred in Florida between 1889 and 1918, only 2 of them had happened in Leon County. But so Washington would visit FAMC at that time. And when he visited FAMC, it was led by President Nathan B. Young. And in Tallahassee, he would speak to about 5,000 people, about 200 of whom were white. And Washington was very impressed by the campus at Florida A&M College. And when he went in to speak on the campus, the audience arose and gave what was called a Chautauqua salute, where the people had handkerchiefs and they were waving the handkerchiefs profusely in the air as Washington came to the stage. And if you look at, this is one of the graduating classes of 1904 from the Florida State Normal School, but Washington thought that the state of Florida had done a great job in providing the best plant and best equipment of any state in the Union for African Americans in Florida. Now you have to know that as he traveled to other states, he would make similar remarks. So some of these were said just for white consumption. But this is a Carnegie Library that still exists on FAMU's campus today. It's called today the Meek Eaton Black Archives, but it was donated by Andrew Carnegie. This is the FAMC Mechanic Arts Building. So you can see these are brick structures that Washington had an opportunity to see while he was on the campus in Tallahassee. Leaving Tallahassee, Washington would travel over to Lake City. And according to newspaper reports, Lake City had a notorious reputation for keeping African Americans in their place. And so less than a year before he arrived in Lake City, 6 Black men who were taken there for safekeeping were lynched. And so this was not a very inviting place for Washington to go to speak, but he spoke there. He was welcomed by the Black citizens of the community, and white citizens also turned out. And even though they looked at him with a stoic kind of look on their faces, ultimately he was able to win over the crowd in Lake City. Leaving from Lake City, Washington would travel to Pensacola, Florida, to Ocala, Florida. And what's interesting about that is that based on the uproar that had taken place in 1903, he passed Gainesville and traveled to Ocala. Ocala is a little unique here because in Ocala, the situation was entirely different from Lake City. In Ocala, there were 2 blacks that served on the board of aldermen. Black people had large farms, grocery stores, drug stores, automobiles, and nice homes. There was a Black-owned Ocala Bazaar and Commercial Company, which became one of the leading businesses of the city. It was managed by a man named Frank P. Gaston. And so the environment in Ocala was a lot different. Washington was introduced here by a Southern white judge from Ocala, a man by the name of William S. Bldg, during his talk in Ocala. And I know time is moving along, so I'm just going to kind of move ahead here. But he had a very successful visit, and Ocala was really noted for its business progress in the state of Florida. One of the things, there was after Washington's visit to Ocala, less than a year later, a little over a year later, we see the opening of a Metropolitan Savings Banks. And I believe that it was a complete nexus between the opening of that bank and people being inspired by Washington's visit, because many of the people who served as president and vice president and cashier of that bank were members of the National Negro Business League, just so you all know. And so Washington's party, and I know this is what many people came to hear about, left Ocala and actually visited next Tampa. And so they would arrive in Tampa on March 4th, 1912. And many Black and white people showed up to hear Washington because of his popularity and because of their belief in his philosophy. And so around March 2nd, an announcement went out that an admission fee of about 50 cents to 75 cents would be charged for people to attend this speech until all of the expenses were met at the Tampa Bay Casino. And after which, those who were unable to pay would be able to come in for free. But the coordinators of this affair did not follow their own rules. And to Washington's chagrin, they continued to charge people even after they had raised enough money to cover their expenses. And so when Emmett Scott, Washington's secretary, learned of this, he insisted that they stop collecting this extra money. And after Washington found out, he considered not speaking in Tampa at all, because he said that he was not visiting Florida to try and make money off of Tampa Negroes, the Black people in Florida. So all of this delayed Washington's speech. But ultimately, and if you look at how the newspapers framed this, one of the reporters who wrote an article about Washington's visit to Tampa, he described the people waiting for Washington to speak as some of the dressed up darkies sweated axle grease while they waited for Washington to speak, in such disparaging terms. But nonetheless, Emmett Scott and others prevailed upon Washington to give his lecture to more than 1,000 people who were anxious to hear from him. Seating in the casino remained divided by race, and a number of Northern tourists visiting Tampa also heard his address. And after the program, the Tampa Business League provided Washington with what the newspaper called a good Spanish supper at Ybor City. And they also attended a smoker where cigars were furnished by J. Andrew Williams of the Williams Cigar Company. Now, unfortunately, Washington became very ill by the time he retired for the evening. And according to Robert Moton, who slept in a room next to Washington, his condition led him to believe that Washington might not live through the night. But fortunately, he had the 2 physicians with him, John A. Kinney and George C. Hall, and they were able to treat Washington throughout the night. And despite Moton's premonition to the contrary, Washington bounced back the very next day. He went fishing the next day, and they said that he was the most enthusiastic angler of their group, and you couldn't even tell that he'd been sick the night before. They would leave Tampa and travel to Lakeland. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there because I know that we have less time for the presentation, and I do want to spend some time kind of talking about his last stop, but he did travel to Lakeland, Florida, which also was a dangerous place for people of African descent to live. There had been lynchings in Lake City as well as Lakeland. Let me just move on here. So when Washington, kind of move us ahead here. So Washington, when he left Lakeland, and he gave a very successful speech in Lakeland. He was actually introduced in Lakeland by the mayor, a man by the name of S.L.A. Cluntz, and then also a man by the name of J.A. Cox, who represented the county school board there, spoke very highly of Washington and was a participant on the program. And when Washington got up to speak there, he said he had one object for coming to speak in the state, and that was to see for himself the progress that was being made among Black and white people, and how the existing race relations between the Black man and the white man were in that particular area. And his speech went over very, very well. Washington would leave there and actually travel to all Black Eatonville, where he visited the, and these are pictures of Washington speaking, and you can see that the crowds were very large crowds when he spoke. But in Eatonville, he visited the Robert Hungerford Normal and Industrial School. And this school was started in 1899 by a Tuskegee graduate by the name of Russell C. Calhoun. And it was a very successful school in all Black Eatonville. And when Russell Calhoun died in 1910, his wife Mary, who you see pictured on this slide, actually took over and continued to run the school effectively. And she also attended Tuskegee Institute. And they would name one of their major and their first and large building on the campus, Washington Hall. It was the most prominent building on that campus. From Eatonville, Washington and his entourage would travel to Daytona, and they would visit the Daytona Normal and Industrial Institute for training Negro girls, which was headed by none other than Mary McLeod Bethune. As we know, she would become a very prominent figure in the Black experience, but she served as the president of the National Association of Colored Women, vice president of the National Urban League, and was the founder of what would become Bethune-Cookman College. And these are just some pictures of Mary McLeod Bethune. Now, Washington would leave there and he would visit Palatka next. And from Palatka, I believe the last and most colorful stop on Washington's tour was in Jacksonville. And that's why I wanted to spend my concluding time talking about his visit to Jacksonville. And in order to make this last engagement, Washington had to travel by a special train from Daytona. And so there was a newspaper that said that was probably the first time that a special train had been made up to accommodate a Negro in the state of Florida. But Washington would arrive in Jacksonville on the evening of the 7th. And the Jacksonville Negro Business League, which was probably the strongest business league in the state, they had expended a lot of time preparing for Washington's visit. And so a number of the leading Black citizens who were also members of the National Negro Business League, like A.L. Lewis and Joseph Bldg and Charles Anderson and Leroy Pratt, and others helped to pull this visit together for Washington and Jacksonville. Just to give a quick highlight of some of these individuals, A.L. Lewis was a founder of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company. It's said that by 1926, Lewis was earning about $1,000 per month, while comparatively speaking, mechanics were earning about $48 a month, and brick masons about $200 a month. And also, he was a founder of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, which was a prominent Black life insurance company. There was also Joseph H. Bldg, who did not receive any formal education because he had to work on a farm as a youth, but nonetheless, he overcame tremendous odds, and he would become a owner of a wood yard. He operated a farm and restaurant, but mostly became a real estate developer and builder in 1898. I showed you a picture of his home. That was his home there, a two-story home. He entertained Washington at his home, and Bldg owned over 100 rental properties in Duval County and built over 258 homes after the Great Fire of 1901. And so A.L. Lewis and Joseph Bldg are acknowledged as the first Black millionaires in Florida. And there were others like Charles Anderson, who was owner of the Anderson Fish and Oyster Company. You can see a picture of like the Masonic Temple in Jacksonville that Black people constructed. This is the Black Business District. L.L. Pratt was owner of the Pratt Funeral Home in Jacksonville. And so there was a very prominent group of people supporting Washington in this area. So when Washington, in my last few minutes, visited Jacksonville, he addressed one of the largest crowds on the entire tour. Some 2,500 Black and white people attended his speech at the Duval Theater, but the Black community was on edge during his visit because a few days earlier, Eugene Baxter, who was described in a newspaper as a tall, light-skinned darky, had been charged with murdering a white grocer named Simon Silverstein and robbing his store and severely beating his wife, son, and daughter. And so Baxter, along with Tom White and Sam Richardson and two other Blacks, were arrested and implicated in the crime. And this murder stirred such intense racial feeling that some of Washington's friends believed that there was going to be a lynching that was going to take place in Jacksonville, and fearing for Washington's safety, they encouraged him to cancel his engagement to Jacksonville. But he refused to do so, and instead he insisted that he had to be at Jacksonville because of what was taking place. And so interestingly, as he rode to the Duval Theater, along with his entourage of different people, one of the automobiles in his entourage was stopped by an excited crowd of white men who demanded that Booker T. Washington be handed over to them. But when they did not see Washington, they allowed that car to pass without molesting the occupant of the car because he had confidence of both races in Jacksonville. And so Washington would arrive at the Duval Theater. They had different selections. He was introduced by a white lawyer in Jacksonville, George C. Bedell, to the rest of the people. And Washington would give an outstanding address, right? He talked about proper leadership and getting rid of immoral leaders, the value of manual labor, the value of having people who were committed to trying to make conditions better in our communities. And as he was giving this speech, Washington heard the howls of a mob in the distance on his way to lynch the accused murderers of Simon Silverstein. And without addressing that directly, he would launch into a fervent denunciation of lynching, and he would end with an earnest and eloquent appeal for the better feeling between the races. And so this was a very bold move for Washington, because many of his adversaries oftentimes criticized him for not speaking out more boldly against lynching. But in fact, at this particular moment, when his life was in danger, he spoke up against the practice of lynching of African Americans. And so they had a reception after his speech was over. It was attended by a number of prominent people. Washington and Emmett Jay Scott, who I'm actually working on a book project on now that will be coming out later this year, were the guest of Abraham Lincoln Lewis. And let me see here, as I wrap up, you should know that all of these contributions by Black entrepreneurs and educators work to provide a better quality of life for African Americans in Duval County and surrounding counties. And Washington, probably the most successful stop on the tour, was in Jacksonville, and Lake City was the most hostile. But W.B. Du Bois, who was the leader of the NAACP, commented on Washington's trip at that particular time, because the story was covered in many of the Black newspapers. They praised the New York Age, and other papers praised Booker T. Washington for his speaking successes throughout the state of Florida. And Du Bois was particularly careful not to criticize Washington, but he blandly acknowledged his trip with one sentence in Crisis magazine. He said, Booker T. Washington and friends have been in the state of Florida making speeches, and that was all he had to say. And so this is really a bigger story, and it really led me to writing another book on Booker T. Washington called Booker T. Washington and the Struggle Against White Supremacy, that covers all of these tours, actually 5 of those tours from 1908 to 1912, and they present a broader picture of the meaning of what these tours were all about and the success Washington had in traveling throughout the state and giving these speeches. So I'll stop there because I know we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions that you all may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. You really did bring him to life. So interesting. Well, we do have questions. The first one, how did Washington's family cope with all of his travels?
So, of course, it placed a strain on his family because he was away from Tuskegee a lot. In fact, he had a residence in New York, but he had a support system. And so Emmett Scott, his personal secretary, really ran the day-to-day operations of the university. And, you know, he was accused of being a spy for Booker T. Washington. So they kept very meticulous records. And Washington managed that situation, but he was able to go out and generate resources for Tuskegee. So during his lifetime, Tuskegee was the best funded university in the South. That's including Black and white universities in the South because of the white philanthropists that donated to Tuskegee. Andrew Carnegie at one point gave Washington millions of dollars and told him to take the first 600,000 off the top for himself and his family, but he didn't do that because he didn't think it would go over well.
All right, here's another one. When was the last lynching of a Black man in Florida? Do you happen to know?
No, I don't. And the terminology around that can be a little complicated because of some of the things that are taking place in terms of some of the things that have taken place in the state of Florida and throughout the country that are going on today, right? And so I don't know the exact date of the lynching, but the lynching of Claude Neal is significant in 1934 because it marked a turning point for these lynchings where you had mobs of people that would show up en masse, where you have thousands of people. It was so much embarrassment brought to the state and throughout the country that James McGovern in his book, The Anatomy of a Lynching, argues that this was a turning point for lynchings throughout the South, and they tended not to take place with those large groups anymore, but you have 1 or 2 people that would kidnap African Americans and shoot them and kill them in that kind of fashion, like what happened with Emmett Till in Mississippi.
Of course. Here's one more. Do you happen to know why Booker T. Washington was sick after his Tampa talk? Was it food poisoning?
That's a great question. And unfortunately, the evidence is not available to really for us to determine what took place and the way that they operated, because Washington was very much concerned about the projection of his image. And so it would be very, hard to determine if they suspected there was some poisoning taking place. So we just don't know, but it would be buried perhaps in the Booker T. Washington papers, but that would be something certainly that they would try not to make public.
How many students did Tuskegee have in the early 1900s?
They had several hundred students, so I've seen up to 300 and 400 students that attended during Washington's lifetime.
Okay, I think that might be the last question.
Okay. I will add one more point, if I may, Cynthia, that Tuskegee Institute was the largest employer of Black college graduates at that time as well. And so W.B. Du Bois almost took a job at Tuskegee, but he received a letter of offer from Booker T. Washington a week after he had accepted a job at Wilberforce University in Ohio. And so Washington hired Black people who had degrees from Harvard University, from Oberlin. His wives were liberal arts trained. He was married 3 times, and he succeeded the first two wives because they passed away, but they were educated in the liberal arts fashion from Fisk University, etc. And so that's another interesting component and facet of Washington's life.
I think this will be our last question, and it's a long one. One person is curious to learn more about Washington's relationship with Julius Rosenwald and the 5,000 schools they established together. This is something my son and I have been trying to find more about, but there's not a whole lot. Have you come across much on this topic?
Well, actually, there's a book on the Rosenwald schools. I cannot think of the title of it now. I think the University Press of Florida published that particular book. Yeah, so Rosenwald was a great supporter of Booker T. Washington and the endeavors of Washington through not only Tuskegee Institute, but also the National Negro Business League. And through the Business League and the affiliates of the Business League, Rosenwald would even invest in different Black enterprises. So, for example, in Mountain Bayou, Mississippi, where Charles Banks lived, Rosenwald contributed tens of thousands of dollars. He invested in the oil mill seed plant that they built in Mountain Bayou that was valued at $100,000. So they had a very, very close relationship. And so Washington, and looking at the Rosenwald schools, and that's really a good question, and I've thought about writing something about this, is that a lot of the graduates of Tuskegee did not go out and become artisans. A lot of the graduates went on to found and start schools. And some of them were the benefactors of the largesse of Roosevelt and him supporting them and starting these schools as Rosenwald schools, as Rosenwald schools, and others built their own schools as well. So that's a chapter that really needs to be explored more, but there is a book that deals with in detail the Rosenwald schools that were developed and the history of those different schools throughout the South.
Well, Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in. I will tell you that David is packing his boxes now and will be undertaking a new venture. He's moving to Durham, North Carolina, and he's going to become provost and vice chair for academic affairs at North Carolina Central University.
Yes.
Best of luck.
Well,
and
thank
thank
you so
you
much.
Once again.
Yes, thank you for inviting me, and it's been my pleasure to talk to the group today. Thank you all very kindly for attending.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.